In a quiet town where everything seems ordinary, a darkness lurks, unseen, unsuspected. Ed Gein, a name that whispers fear, a name that chills bone. But who was he really? Just another man or a monster hiding behind a friendly smile? Brace yourself for a journey into a world where reality and nightmares bleed into one. Today, we descend into the shadowy depth of the human psyche and unravel one of the most chilling mysteries in criminal history. This is the story of a man whose life and crimes became the foundation for countless films and books, inspiring entire genres of horror. In a small, forgotten town, buried deep within endless forests, lived a man whose existence became a waking nightmare for those around him. His strange fascinations and unsettling habits stirred whispers of fear, but it was his home, filled with unspeakable horrors, that became a symbol of pure evil. We will uncover how an ordinary life can conceal the most unimaginable secrets, and how one man twisted his reality into something beyond comprehension. Prepare to step into a world where reality and terror merge, where the line between normalcy and madness vanishes. In the mid-20th century, as America stood on the brink of profound societal change, a series of unspeakable horrors unfolded, crimes that would etch one man's name into the darkest pages of history. The 1940s and 1950s were an era of post-war transformation, a time when the nation was rebuilding itself after World War II, while grappling with new and unsettling realities. By 1945, the war had ended, ushering in a period of economic prosperity. Returning soldiers sought the comfort of normalcy, buying homes, starting families, and chasing the American dream. Yet beneath this polished surface lurked deepest social fractures, poverty, racism, and inequality that fed a growing sense of unease. This undercurrent of fear and distrust created the perfect breeding ground for society's fascination with crime and the macabre. Interest in criminal psychology in the minds of killers was on the rise. The emergence of crime reporting and the first documentaries about serial murderers made the public more attuned to the horrors that lurked in the shadows. When a series of grisly crimes shattered the peace of a small town, it wasn't just a local tragedy, it became a national obsession, a symbol of terror that gripped the entire country. At the heart of American culture were family values and rigid gender roles, ideals that had defined society for decades. But as feminism gained traction and social norms began to shift, these traditions came under scrutiny. The acts of a madman exposed the terrifying truth that even in the most idyllic homes, behind the white picket fences, the darkest secrets could fester. Society was beginning to realize that sometimes monsters don't hide in the shadows, they live among us. The 1950s marked the beginning of a deeper exploration into the minds of criminals. New theories in motivation and psychopathy emerged, shifting society's perception of crime from mere evil to something that could be studied, analyzed, and perhaps even understood. This growing curiosity fueled the rise of criminal psychology and forensic science, forever changing the way investigators approach the darkest corners of human behavior. The murders that took place during this era weren't just isolated horrors, they were deeply intertwined with the cultural and social shifts of the time. The fear that it inspired wasn't only about one man's monstrous acts, it was a reflection of broader anxieties, of a world where the lines between sanity and madness, normalcy and depravity were becoming increasingly blurred. This small town's nightmare became more than a local tragedy. It left an indelible mark on criminal history and psychology, shaping public perception of what lurked beneath the surface of ordinary life. The horrors that unfolded were not just the work of one man, they were a symptom of something much larger, a chilling mirror held up to the hidden fears of an evolving society. Ed Gein, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, was born on August 27, 1906, in the small town of La Crosse, Wisconsin. His childhood was nothing short of a breeding ground for darkness, a life shaped by isolation, fear, and a twisted sense of morality that would one day lead him down a path of unimaginable horror. Ed was the second child of Augusta and George Gein, growing up alongside his older brother Henry. His father, a violent alcoholic, cast a shadow of instability over the family. while his mother, a fanatically religious woman, ruled their home with an iron grip. Augusta preached endlessly about sin, corruption, and the inherent evil of man, planting deep, festering seeds in young Ed's impressionable mind, especially when it came to his perception of women. When Ed was still a boy, his father succumbed to heart failure, brought on by years of alcoholism, leaving the family in dire straits. Augusta, determined to shield her sons from what she saw as the wickedness of the outside world, tightened her grip, isolating them from the community. The Gain brothers spent most of the days toiling away on the desolate farm, bound to the mother's suffocating influence. For Ed, this meant a life of repression, loneliness, and an ever-growing disconnect from reality. From an early age, he displayed disturbing tendencies. Withdrawn and socially inept, he buried himself in books, many of them filled with tales of violence, death, and macabre horrors. His world revolved around his mother, and when she died in 1945, Ed lost his one true anchor to reality. It was the breaking point, the moment when his darkest urges began to consume him, and what followed would become the stuff of nightmares. These early traumas and events played a crucial role in shaping Ed Gain's fractured mind. As the years passed, he began to identify with women in unsettling ways, manifesting in his desire to wear women's clothing and eventually his grotesque obsession with crafting female figures from human remains. His psyche, scarred by years of trauma and isolation, drove him to seek out disturbing ways to fill the unbearable void left in his life. In the end, this descent into madness would culminate in unspeakable crimes, acts so horrifying they would haunt the world for decades. Understanding these elements allow us to glimpse the terrifying reality of how deep psychological wounds and extreme circumstances can unravel a person, leading them down a path of nightmarish consequences. Gain embarked on his gruesome path at a relatively late age. His early crimes, while not as horrifying as his later atrocities, nonetheless exposed the spiraling madness and morbid obsession with the human body. In November 1945, Gain was arrested for the illegal possession of human bones on his farm. Authorities discovered several graves he had desecrated in a local cemetery. When confronted, he confessed to exhuming bodies, explaining in chilling details that he had been trying to craft a woman's suit, so he could in a sense become his deceased mother. Though grave robbing was a serious offense, Gain was deemed mentally ill and committed to a psychiatric hospital, where he remained for nearly a decade. But despite his confinement, he was never truly rehabilitated. News of his crime sent shockwave through the community. The sheer desecration of the dead, an act of grotesque defilement, was met with horror and outrage. Law enforcement began to suspect Gain of even more sinister activities, but at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything beyond grave robbing. Then, in 1954, Gain crossed an irreversible line. He lured Mary Hogan, the owner of a local tavern, into his car and brought her back to his home. Gain had taken the next terrifying step, becoming a full-fledged serial killer. Over the next few years, he would go on to claim more victims, each death pulling him deeper into a nightmare of his own making. One of Gain's most infamous crimes was the murder of Bernice Worden in 1957, a crime that would ultimately expose the full extent of his monstrous deeds. Bernice Worden was a well-respected woman in her small community, known for her kindness and warm demeanor. She owned a local hardware store and was always eager to help her customers. But on the morning of November 16, 1957, everything changed. When Bernice failed to open her store as usual, her son, Frank Worden, a sheriff's deputy, grew concerned. By late afternoon, around 5 p.m., Frank entered the shop and immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The cash register was open and dark stains, blood, marked the floor. His mother was nowhere to be found. Frank knew she wouldn't simply vanish without a trace. As investigators dug deeper, one name kept resurfacing: Ed Gain. He had been a frequent visitor to Bernice's store, and his odd demeanor had unsettled more than a few locals. Frank told authorities that Gain had been in the shop the previous evening and was supposed to return the next morning to buy a gallon of antifreeze. A receipt for antifreeze was found, the last sale Bernice had recorded before she disappeared. This was enough to make Gain the prime suspect. That evening, police arrested him at the local grocery store. Meanwhile, sheriff's deputies made their way to his remote farmhouse, where they would uncover horrors beyond imagination. When authorities stepped inside Ed Gain's house, they walked straight into a nightmare. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Scattered throughout the house were human remains, grotesque trophies crafted from the bodies he had stolen and mutilated. Among these horrors, police also discovered personal belongings, clothing, jewelry, and keepsakes that once belonged to missing women. Each object told a story of unspeakable cruelty, each relic a testament to the mind of a man consumed by madness. Ed Gein's arrest on November 16, 1957, marked the end of his reign of terror. But the true horror was only just beginning. During his interrogation, he confessed in chilling detail to the murder of Bernice Worden and others. He spoke of his grave-robbing rituals, the nights spent digging up bodies, and his twisted compulsion to fashion the remains into objects of his own creation. His words painted a portrait of depravity so profound that even hardened investigators were left shaken. The trial was nothing short of a horror show. Spectators sat frozen in shock as the grotesque details of Ed Gein's crimes unraveled before them. The courtroom became a theater of nightmares. Tales of grave-robbing dismemberment and a house filled with human remains turned the proceeding into something straight out of a macabre fiction. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Gein remained an enigma. Psychiatric evaluations declared him legally insane, yet he insisted he had no memory of his crimes. His lawyers found desperately to prove his incompetence. But the horror of his actions spoke louder than any defense. The verdict was swift and merciless, guilty of first-degree murder. His punishment? A lifetime confined within the walls of a psychiatric institution, a place where the echoes of his madness could be locked away from the world. For 14 years, Gein remained behind bars, never fully revealing the depth of his twisted psyche or the true motivations behind his monstrous acts. His story ended in silence, but the legends of his horrors would live on forever. Edward Gein was a labyrinth of madness. A man twisted by forces both internal and external, shaped by a childhood that was more nightmare than nurture. Experts who have dissected his psyche agree on one thing: he was deeply, irreparably broken. Diagnosed with multiple severe mental disorders, Gein's mind was a battleground of horrors. But why? Why did he become the monster history remembers? The answer lies in the perfect storm of trauma and psychosis. His childhood was a crucible of isolation and cruelty, dominated by a mother who poisoned his mind with fear, guilt, and the belief that women were corrupt creatures of sin. Sex to Ed was something grotesque, twisted and forbidden. His attraction to the dead was not simply desire, but a warped attempt to understand what had been forbidden to him in life. And then there was his obsession, the belief that he was meant to be a woman. He killed not out of hatred, not even out of lust, but to construct something unthinkable, a suit of flesh stitched together from the bodies of his victims, a grotesque second skin that would let him become someone new. Edward Gein was not just a murderer, he was a horror story written in human skin, a man whose sickness ran so deep that his crimes became legend. And even now, long after his death, his madness lingers in the darkest corners of the human imagination. His nightmarish legacy seeped into the veins of popular culture, giving birth to some of the most chilling horror films, novels and television shows ever conceived. Time and again, filmmakers and writers return to the twisted story of Gein, crafting characters who embodied the terror of the unknown. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho brought Norman Bates to life, a quiet, unassuming man ruled by the spectral presence of his overbearing mother. Bates, with his fractured mind and his gruesome double life, was Gein in everything but name. A year later, The Silence of the Lambs introduced the world to Hannibal Lecter, a refined, intelligent killer whose fascination with human anatomy mirrored Gein's own grotesque obsessions. Anthony Hopkins' bone-chilling portrayal of Lecter left an imprint on audiences, solidifying the character as one of the most terrifying figures in cinematic history. And then there was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Tobe Hooper's brutal, unrelenting masterpiece. Though not a direct adaptation, the film's monstrous antagonist, Leatherface, bore an undeniable resemblance to Gein. The House of Horrors, the human remains repurposed into household items, the faceless terror hiding behind a mask of human skin. It was all Gein's nightmare, born on the silver screen. But the real horror of Gein's crimes was not just in the way they inspired fiction. It was in how they shattered the illusion of safety. His atrocities made Americans question whether the quiet, unremarkable man living next door could be hiding horrors beyond imagination. His case fueled fears of rising tide of violence, sparking demands for stronger law enforcement and a harsher punishment for violent offenders. Psychologists and psychiatrists became obsessed with understanding the mind of a man like Gain. His diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, became the subject of extensive studies, with researchers dissecting his relationship with his mother and the role it played in his descent into madness. His crimes forced uncomfortable questions about mental illness and its connection to violence, questions that lingered long after his story faded from the headlines. In the world of criminology, Gain's case became a landmark. His twisted methods, his grotesque motivations, everything about him became a blueprint for criminal profiling. His story helped shape the investigative techniques used to hunt serial killers, offering a terrifying glimpse into the minds of those who walked the same monstrous paths he had paved. Edward Gain may have died in 1984, but his shadow never faded. His crimes wormed their way into the American consciousness, lingering in every whispered ghost story, in every nightmare, in every cinematic boogeyman who wears a face that is not his own. And so we come to the end of our journey into the life of a man whose existence became a waking nightmare for so many. His story is more than just a chronicle of unspeakable crimes. It's a deep exploration of the human psyche, of fear, and of the darkness that can lurk within us all. His actions not only shock society to its core, but it also gave birth to countless myths, legends, and inspirations for films, books, and even music. If you enjoyed this video and want to delve deeper into similar topics, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We invite you to step into the dark room of our channel, where we uncover the most intriguing and shocking tales from the world of criminology and psychology. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay in the light.